Good evening, everyone. Glad to have you with us. I especially want to thank this evening so many of you that wrote or contacted me in the course of this week. I still am offering the syllabus and the mileposts and Revelation article that I wrote for you. Just come to my email address and I'll send it to you. But I had quite a response. I think I broke my own personal record, I guess, for YouTube broadcasts, and appreciate each and every one of you for that. I'm going to go ahead and get immediately underway, as we've got just a tremendous amount of information to try to cover this evening. So it's going to be very fast. I can certainly warn you on that. Let's start with just the realization that this particular class is yet another of rigging the ship kind of classes. Now, I've still got a little ways to go just getting set up with the mechanics of all of this. And then we've got probably 8 more classes to go at least of an introductory nature before we get into the book of Revelation itself. So what we're going to be doing today is first just apologizing. We had quite a few technical difficulties last week. Talked to, again, several people, hoping that we'll get, improved over the course of the next few weeks, but shot ourselves in the foot a little bit, and most of it my fault, to be sure. I am buying new equipment. We're changing some software, but it was a bit out of focus last week, I know. I completely failed also to curate the video on YouTube after it was over, despite the fact that Scott, one of our deacons, was just magnificent and gave me all kinds of advance warning and encouraging me to get after it. I was just busy here and there and never got at it. So my apologies for that, but we'll make sure that we get things straightened out on YouTube so it's easier to find and view as well. As finding us goes, I had a number of questions about locating it on YouTube, so I thought quickly I'd go through this tonight. All you got to do is just go to Google, go to the regular Google search engine website there. And in the upper right-hand corner, that's that little waffle I just circled in red. If you'll click on that, it'll bring up that pop-up menu in your upper right-hand corner, most likely. And then you want to just circle YouTube. You come over then, that'll bring you to this window. When I did it earlier today, we had Buffalo Springfield and John Denver and the Rocky and Bullwinkle show were all options. They'll be changing every time you tune in. But there's a search window at the top. If you just type in Sumner Church of Christ and hit return, then today it popped up this screen for me. And again, these icons will be changing from week to week. But you'll see the Sumner Church of Christ will be right up there at the top. So click on the button. That's our kind of watermark, I guess. The icon, it's the sponsorship and going to be on every slide, I think. That'll bring you to this screen. And from here, it kind of varies a little bit. Sometimes you'll find that my next Revelation class is there, but you'll see playlists I've just circled. If you'll hit playlists, then as these weeks go by, there'll be a playlist developing that'll look very much like the one that you see there, second one in that top row. So, it's always going to be some photograph of me and then an explanation of the material that we've been talking about, which class it is you can select. Now, the next thing I'd like to do tonight is to remind everyone that this book, which I have always printed out in the past and bound together at the various churches I presented this material for, you're all welcome to have a copy in an electronic format. Just write me, Larry, at truthondisc, truthondisc.com. Request that material, and I'll send you the electronic version of this. I have 2 forms, though, so I do have one that's bound. I have another one that's much smaller. The larger one on every page has got some blank lines for you to take notes on next to each page that we're actually talking about. The smaller one does not have those note-taking lines, so the print is smaller. It's also more compact, and you'll be able to slip it right inside the cover of a typical Bible. So if you'd like to request either one of those, make sure you specify if you want the larger one or the smaller one. And if you want to, go ahead and ding me in the email and say, well, it's a hassle to print and hard to bind and all that. Can you provide, a bound copy? I'd be more than happy to do that. I'm hoping, we'll have enough people kind of make it worth my while. But I'll need to charge you something for that. I'm going to have to mail it. So for $10, I'll send you the whole 32-page large size with note-taking lines and one copy of the smaller one as well. So I'm just, very much only breaking even there. But if you really want to have the printed and bound versions, let me know. And, I'll go ahead and get down and print some more of those here pretty soon. That being said, I'm going to go full screen for a little while now. You don't really need to see me so much in all this material anyway. But I want to go through the first few pages of that syllabus as we begin our second class on introductory material. And so what we have is my cover note, and the right-hand side there is an actual copy of the page that is entitled Introduction in my syllabus. You can see I originally created this in September of 1987. It has now been updated. But I'm going to skip over all that and you read it yourself. We're going to be on this page, though, for a little while yet tonight. I do recommend a total of actually 5 books and a couple of other things that you might consider purchasing. Some of you already have, as a matter of fact, I was told this week. And the first one there is called The Avenging of the Apostles and Prophets. There will be extremely little that I'm going to be presenting to you that I didn't get from Arthur Ogden, whom I met personally in 1987, with whom I studied at length in a verse-by-verse class that he taught, which I also recorded as I found that material so fascinating on VHS. That's the cover of the book right there. It is the best of all the commentaries, I think, currently. It's not very big. You can get it in paperbacks, not very expensive. But if you'll contact the Ogden Biblical Resources, which is just aogden.com, then you can get a copy of one of those, and really not very expensive. The second listing that I have under suggested studies is called The Wars of the Jews. Next to only the Bible, I believe this is the most important book that all Christians should read. You read your Bible first, then you get a copy of Wars of the Jews. A recent translation by a living Jewish scholar is this one, Josephus, the Jewish War, by Gallia. I hope you can see it at the bottom of the cover there. Gaalya Kornfeld, Cornfeld. He did a masterful thing in creating a coffee table sized book, National Geographic glossy pages, color photographs, black and white photographs, and an extensive commentary on the first century Jewish Pharisee who watched the temple fall and the siege of Jerusalem before it, as he had been a Jewish general fighting the Romans at that time. And so Josephus writes about what he saw at the end of Jerusalem and especially the temple. Gallia Kornfeld translates that from the original into English, adds an enormous amount of commentary and photographs. It's just the best version to have. Buy a used copy on Amazon. You typically get it for about $40. You may see listings for over $300. $40 is what you're looking for. The next book I want to highly recommend is called Before Jerusalem Fell, Dating the Book of Revelation by Kenneth L. Gentry. Kenneth Gentry, I'll recommend 2 books of his. Kenneth has written this lengthy book about all the evidences internally and externally for the book of Revelation's writing. When did John write the book? Now, I've often said this, a lot of times I've said this, I say it again tonight. Anybody who has not read this book and then forms an opinion on when John was on Patmos, who put him there, and when he wrote the book of Revelation, that person has formed an uninformed opinion. This may not be the best book ever written before Jerusalem fell, but on the dating of the book of Revelation, I think it's the single best source you can go to hear both sides of that argument. You haven't read this book, then you don't have a very well-informed opinion of when this book of Revelation was written. You haven't really seen all the evidence, most of the evidence, or the best evidence. So you might want to think about that. But I've got, a little bit better option for you, maybe. This book, Before Jerusalem Fell, has also been turned in to a DVD. So if you want to go online, look for Kenneth Gentry's Before Jerusalem Fell in a DVD format. That'll be a lot shorter, but of course a lot more visual. Some of you may prefer that approach. But even better than that is the number 4 listing in my syllabus for suggested studies. It's this book called The Beast of Revelation. I think the cover's changed a couple of times. This is the way my personal copy looked a few years back. The Beast of Revelation by Dr. Kenneth Gentry. This is 2 books under one cover. The title is even actually a little bit misleading in that regard. You would think it's all about that last verse in Revelation 13 and who does the 666 represent. But only half the book is devoted to that. The other half is a condensation of Before Jerusalem Fell. So if you buy The Beast of Revelation by Kenneth Gentry, it's a twofer. And that's really the one to have. It is a not, stripped down so much that it's not adequate discussion of the major arguments on the date. And it's a great discussion of the Revelation 666 number. So, I suppose if you can only buy one book on my list, well, get Ogden's book, The Avenging of the Apostles and Prophets. Buy this one, second or third, depending on how deep you want to get into the history, and then come over onto those 2 topics. Next, I'll suggest for you Gary DeMar's excellent work, though there are very many that are like this. I'm just picking one of them. Gary DeMar's Last Days Madness, the obsession of the modern church, thinking that the end times are our times, any day now, as so many religious groups have been teaching since the 1800s, particularly in America. Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, just so many. And so this gives you a much larger overview, I guess, of end times prophecies. Highly recommend that. Got quite a bit to say about the book of Revelation. One that I did not put into my syllabus, but I would like to highly recommend, difficult to find, is called The 70 Weeks and the Great Tribulation by Philip Mauro. This is actually a study of the book of Daniel, of course, and that small passage about the 70 weeks, but one of the more difficult passages in Scripture. So, I'd highly recommend that you get this, though, for your Daniel studies, and it'll serve you well in Revelation also. So there's my suggested study list. You can look at some of the recordings I have for DVD and audio and the rest of that later. The popular methods of interpretation then comes up next in the syllabus. We already talked about that last week, so you won't have any more time on that this evening. But I would like for you to note that at the bottom of this page, you get the first of these assignments. I typed there, assignment lessons number 1 and 2 in Ogden's Revelation workbook. Some of you will appreciate getting Art, now deceased, commentary, The Avenging of the Apostles and Prophets, but he has a companion workbook, much smaller, but now you have some, examples and activities that, assignments to perform. You might want to get a copy of that as well, just a few dollars, but I tried to tie my syllabus to that a little bit. So at the bottom of each one of my thoughts on these pages, you'll find an assignment in his workbook as well. Now, for just a minute, I guess I'll come back over here, and remind you that I really am still teaching this class. So last week, believe it or not, one of the first, I guess it was the very first comment I got about why we were not getting the high definition quality we wanted out of the recording was that I had worn a striped shirt, and that really wreaks havoc, I guess, on the compressions that these data files have to go through. So I promise I'd never wear another striped shirt while we're videotaping here. I'm hoping, Jeff, then, for your sake, that the tie is not too loud. I love my loud ties. For as far as brand goes, there's only two brands that I have more than one tie from. It'll tell you maybe a little bit about Larry Haverstock, and I've got quite a collection of Jerry Garcia ties, founder of the Grateful Dead. Makes great ties he did before he passed away so long ago. And the others are along this line, which is Rush Limbaugh's line of ties from 15 years ago, I suppose it was. I like loud ties, and both of those guys, do really that. Might tell you a little bit, about my mind, I guess, but I just, wanted to go on the record. Whatever you think of the politics of these two guys, they sure make fabulous ties, and I'm hoping Jeff will let me continue to wear them here from week to week. So for a little bit, we'll go double screen here. This is going to be a tough class. You can tell I really kicked it into gear. I am speaking awful fast. Those of you that get the MP3 recordings of this later, you can slow it down maybe. But we're going to be talking about when the book was written. Dating the book of Revelation's authorship has proven to be, I believe, the single most misunderstood and single most derailing topic for properly understanding Revelation that there is. There's a lot of views on the book of Revelation, but there is a fork in the road that virtually everybody takes before they even start reading the book, that is, studying it to figure out what it says. And depending on which fork you take, everything changes. The two books become unrecognizable next to each other. They are so radically differently understood. So tonight, I want to, dip into this subject. Get Before Jerusalem Fell. It's a long read. Get Kenneth Gentry's alternate book, The Beast of Revelation, but think about when this book was written, because here's the deal. Most people, the great majority of people, at least in the last century or so, have, in my humble opinion, made a horrific mistake. They decided before they even try to understand the book that it was written under the time of Domitian, probably in the last half of the 90s. And that therefore, the things which are shortly to come to pass cannot possibly be talking about the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. A thing that is shortly to come to pass can't lie 25 years behind you. So since most people bought the late date, eliminated a first century fulfillment from all their thinking. It wouldn't even allow it. It wasn't conceivable. It wasn't possible. They laid aside the true meaning of the book and went off in search of some way to understand it. Now think about that for a minute. Even if you take the late date, these things were shortly to come to pass. The time was near. Jesus was coming quickly. We looked at that at length last week. So even if you take the last date, you've got to find an interpretation that would be somewhere then early in the 2nd century. What is that? Because virtually nobody proposes that. Once they abandon Jerusalem as the fulfillment of the majority of this book, then they're in search, brethren, of a mythical beast, in my opinion. And that's why we've had this plethora of opinions on how to understand the book. So as you can tell, I'm going to be arguing vigorously tonight for an early date. Here's my page on the dating of the book of Revelation. It's page 6. I'm going to be talking about some of that tonight. Those of you that already have a copy, you can be looking at it. Right now, I just want to zoom in on the first 2 paragraphs and repeat what I just said. Most Bible students think Revelation was written between 91 and 98 AD, at least 21 years after Rome destroyed Jerusalem. Of course, that which must shortly come to pass, Revelation 1:1, can't lie in the past. So they don't even consider Jerusalem's fall in 70 AD as a possible interpretation for the book. But are they right to reject the single most cataclysmic event in the history of the Jewish people, one repeatedly foretold in the Old Testament as well as the New, often discussed by Jesus? Are they right on the late date? A significant number of very capable Bible students believe Revelation was written between 64 and 68 AD, 2 to 6 years before Jerusalem fell. Hence the title on Kenneth Gentry's book. I don't know Kenneth. I haven't met Kenneth, never talked to him on a phone, even, so I'm not plugging his works, for any personal reasons. It's just great work. But before Jerusalem fell. If so, the catastrophic devastation described in the book fits Jerusalem in 70 AD extremely well and took place shortly after Revelation was written. Now let's go back to a book I mentioned last week again. The book of Revelation, an introduction and commentary by Homer Haley. I cannot recommend everything this man ever did, more highly. I've recorded almost every book in the Bible being taught by him. I've distributed these recordings in various formats, including video, for these many years, back into the 70s. But in this book, he said some things I disagree with. He also said some wonderful, great things that I do. In Homer Haley's commentary on the book of Revelation, on pages 26 and 27, he said, scholars have periodically debated the date for John's receiving and recording the revelation, but the choice usually lies between the time of Nero, AD 64 to 68, and the time of Domitian, AD 91 to 96. Well, amen. That's just a simple fact. He goes on, a formidable array of illustrious names who defend the Neronian date, Nero's time frame as emperor when it was written, could be set over against an equally reputable and scholarly host of defenders of the Domitian date. But this array of names would not resolve the question. Amen. After considering arguments for each of the positions, I, that's Homer Haley, believe that the weight of evidence favors the late date, AD 91 to 96, though there are some strong but inconclusive arguments for the Neronian. Homer was conflicted, and rightly so. It's a formidable array of illustrious names who defend the Neronian date. It is a formidable array of illustrious names that defend the Domitian date. Which one's right? So here's my dating the book of Revelation again. If you're following along with me at home, at all in that, this time, look to the last part of it at the very bottom there, where it says, many extremely, why did that go blank? I wonder on my screen. Give me just a second here, brethren, to try to figure out what I'm looking at, because it doesn't seem right. There we go. Many extremely talented scholars accept and defend the early date. Gentry, again, same man, lists 136 men. F.F. Bruce, Adam Clark, Alfred Edersheim, J.W. Farrar, Philip Schaff, J.B. Lightfoot, Edward Young, Foy E. Wallace. Many of you will know, a member of the Lord's Church. Westcott and Hort embrace the early date. Do these men represent shoddy scholarship? Are we to accuse them of a personal bias or hypocrisy? Should their testimony be ignored, discounted, or denied because it's not the majority opinion? Well, it isn't the majority opinion, but it's getting there. Are these men wrong by virtue of their refusing to go along with the most popular belief? No, you're not wrong because you don't join the majority. So we got to think about this. Here's a copy from 1881 of your original New Testament in the original Greek by Brooke Foss Westcott and Fenton John Anthony Hort. These men, with an introduction in this edition by Philip Schaff, considered by many, maybe most, as being the foremost church historian ever. These men, all of them, are men who endorse the early date that I'm defending. So it's pretty evenly split. Just because you're not necessarily in the majority doesn't make you right or wrong. Here I'll quote again from Homer, pages 26 and 27, Philip Schaff, who accepts and defends the earlier date, has said of John's exile to Patmos and the disputed date, quote from Philip Schaff now, external evidence points to the reign of Domitian in AD 95. That's what Schaff said. And, I think there's a lot of truth in that. That does seem to kind of tilt in favor of the late date if you look outside the book of Revelation at what is external to the pages of your Bible, to the uninspired commentators and writers and historians. Then the external evidence from uninspired men would seem to favor AD 95. But there's another sentence in Homer's commentary. Internal evidence to the reign of Nero, or soon after his death in AD 68. So the external evidence points to Domitian, but the internal evidence points to Nero, a writing of the book when Nero would have put John on Patmos, not Domitian. So let's talk about dating the book of Revelation. Now, for just a minute or two, I'll go ahead and stay on screen with you. I know it can be a little unnerving, I guess, to just watch slides go by. I'm still here, but I've done a lot of work on these slides, and I'm hoping that they'll help you quite a bit. So we'll go back, to full screen again here pretty quickly, probably. But have a look at this. We've just said and seen, and everybody agrees, there are really only two, valid, respectable choices. Before 70 AD and after 70 AD, about 30 years apart. These are our two choices. Now, in Revelation, chapter 2, verse 10, chapter 6, verses 9 through 11, and chapter 13, verse 7, and other places, there is persecution of the saints. For my terrible pace I have to keep tonight, I'm not going to read those. You can read them later. Revelation 2:10, 6:9 through 11, 13:7, and others. We're considering external evidence. Well, there's persecution internally in the book, but the external evidence suggests, or is thought to be, Roman persecution. Persecution by the Romans of the saints. That's attributed, by the way, to Domitian. Neglecting, ignoring, not placing enough emphasis or value, I think, on the persecution of Nero. So there are assumptions being made that this persecution of the Christians by the Romans should be Domitian's. But here's my and everybody else's answer, guys like Philip Schaff and the rest. The Jewish persecution of the saints began much sooner, began immediately. The Jews persecuted the Messiah to death, and then the Christians. Maybe that persecution is an earlier persecution and a Jewish persecution. Jewish persecution was empire-wide. Wherever a Jew became a Christian, he was in trouble throughout the Roman Empire. And even so, brethren, Nero is the first Roman emperor to persecute Christians. That's just an undeniable, unquestionable, well-established historical fact. That's the truth. Now you can argue about, whether or not it was worldwide and all the rest of that kind of stuff. The first Roman emperor who ever persecuted a Christian was Nero. Now, in Revelation 13, verses 3 and following, which I'm going to put on the screen and leave you now. I'm going to go back for a while, to full screen on the slides for those of you who may not be able easily to handle a Bible, and I know that is often the case. And so I'm just trying to help everybody here. I'm going to put all these passages up on the screen. On the left, you'll see we're considering still external evidence. We're going to read first, though, Revelation 13, verses 3 and 4, which says on screen, the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast. They worshiped the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like the beast? Who is able to wage war with him? So there is worship of a dragon and a beast. Brethren, I too, like virtually everybody else, I think, sees Satan and emperor worship in this passage, particularly the earlier verses. If you want to read verses 1 through 4 of Revelation, yeah, I'll go for emperor worship. But is Domitian the first? Do we have to start with a late date? Do we have to assume that this emperor worship doesn't get started before then? Brethren, no. Smyrna is one of the 7 churches of Asia that this book was written to. They had a temple dedicated to Dea Roma, the goddess Rome, in 195 BC. BC. They've been doing this for 250 years before Jerusalem fell. And Nero, in his lifetime, regularly, murderously claimed to be divine and would kill you if you didn't agree. Let's look at a whole water. Now let's look at Revelation chapters 2 and 3. I'll not put them up on the screen. We'll get to those in due time. But the argument from the external evidence is, well, these churches hadn't existed long enough to be described the way they are. Well, we'll talk about that when we get into chapters 2 and 3. But that's just, to me, ridiculous. Well, why not? Galatia had an apostle start and begin its preaching. Galatia had the inspired writers. It may be the oldest book in the New Testament. You know that? It's a contender for the first New Testament book to ever be written. And Galatia, was a wreck after apostolic guidance and epistles in just no time at all. Why can't these churches fall away and lose a first love in a matter of a few years? Galatia pulled it off. How come Ephesus can't? These external evidences have answers, which you'll see more thoroughly perhaps in Before Jerusalem Fell. I'm not going to develop here today. I'm just going to say, if you haven't heard the answers to those arguments, I believe those answers are powerful, moving, convincing, persuasive. For me, they become a proof that the earlier date is far more likely. Let's again look at Revelation 13 and verse 18 now. Mentioned it earlier, we can come back to this. Here's wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast. For the number is that of a man, and his number is 666. Well, there it is. The most popular verse in the whole book, maybe the whole Bible, I suppose. Here's wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast. Now stop. In the first century, when they got the book, if they had wisdom and understanding, they could calculate this number. The number is that of a man. When they added it up, they would know what that number represented. Who was 666? Who is that man? You have wisdom? You have understanding? You want to calculate it out? In the first century, those who had wisdom and understanding knew who the man was that 666 represented. But in the external evidence, brethren, we've got a guy named, and nobody's sure how to pronounce it, I don't think. Maybe Irenaeus, and maybe Irenaeus, and maybe Irenaeus. I'm not sure. Irenaeus, I'll pick this time, was a man, a Christian in some sense of the word, a believer, who lived about 130 to 202 AD. And he had something to say about that number, 666, and why John wrote it that way. This man wrote about 180 to 190 BC. So, 90 to 100 years after even the late date, quite a while. And he is quoted then by Eusebius around 300 AD. Eusebius' writings are very interesting. You know, one of the early church historians, very fascinating author, highly recommended. About 300 AD, he's going to quote Irenaeus. Here's the quote. If it were necessary to have his name, the name that 666 represents, if it were necessary to have that man's name distinctly announced at the present time, 180 to 190 AD, it would doubtless have been announced by him who saw the apocalypse. For it was not a great while ago that, you'll now have to choose, it, the book, or he, the man, was seen. But almost in our own generation, almost in Irenaeus's generation, almost in 180 AD, toward the end of Domitian's reign. Well, now this isn't making any sense in some respects. First, Domitian's reign is 96. And to say almost, you know, running up to 180 is hard to swallow in the first, you know, just to begin. But there's the statement. And the way the majority, reading the external evidence as it is repeated by Eusebius, you know, 120 years after it was originally written, they read it, if it were necessary to have his name distinctly announced at the present time, it would doubtless have been announced by him who saw the apocalypse, for it was not a great while ago that it, the book, was seen, by which they mean written. But almost in our own generation, toward the end of Domitian's reign, which would put the writing of the book down about late 90s, and therefore the late date. There's the external evidence. Here's just one of innumerable articles you can find online or you can read about from Kenneth Gentry and so many others. Let me zoom in on it. The first two paragraphs look like this. It is, and you can get the location of this article, you know, at the top in bold, but the article says in the first two paragraphs, it is important to examine not only where and how Irenaeus came by his opinion, but also what Irenaeus said, because as you will shortly see, it is possible that his testimony has been misunderstood. The statement that Irenaeus makes consists of a testimony about the number of the beast, 666, in Revelation 13:18. A translation from the original Greek is as follows. When you translate, you get slightly differences. So this person's translation is a little bit different than the other one I just read to you. Here's the quote. We therefore do not run the risk of pronouncing positively concerning the name of the Antichrist. For if it were necessary to have his name distinctly announced at the present time, it would doubtless have been announced by him who saw the apocalypse. For it's not a great while ago that it, or he, was seen, but almost in our own generation toward the end of Domitian's reign. Now, I'm going to quote from the middle two paragraphs, if I've zoomed in here, of this same article. In this passage, it must be noted that the subject of the verb was seen is ambiguous in the Greek language. And it may be translated, that is, either it, referring to the apocalypse, the book when Revelation was written, or he, referring to John himself. So the slender thread surfaces. If one chooses to select it, meaning the vision, we have the apocalypse being written at the later date. If he is chosen, meaning John, then the apocalypse is written at the earlier date because he, John, would have seen almost in our own generation. Quite a situation to base your entire end times prophecy doctrine on, would you not say? I am convinced that what Irenaeus was attempting to communicate was something along the following lines. John would have announced the name of the Antichrist if he wanted to, because he, John, was found during the reign of Domitian. Well, if John, I'm now interpreting this man's last statement, if John had lived to the reign of Domitian, he may have written earlier, and he could have told them what he meant earlier when he wrote the 3 digits 666. So if he wanted to communicate it to those people then, near Domitian, under Domitian, he himself could have told them and written the book 30 years earlier. Now, let's zoom in on just the last 2 paragraphs of this article. In another place, this is big, my friends, really big. In another place in the writing of Irenaeus, the same man, and you won't see this very often. This doesn't come up in the external arguments. The majority don't seem to be putting much weight on this one. I start again. In another place in the writings of Irenaeus, again writing about the number 666, he seems to indicate an earlier date for the dating of Revelation. In his 5th book, he writes the following, quote, "As these things are so, and his number is found in all the approved and ancient copies," end quote. Domitian's reign was almost in Irenaeus' own day. But now he writes of the Revelation being written in ancient copies. His statement at least gives some doubt as to the vision being seen in AD 95, almost in his own day, and even suggests a time somewhat removed from his own day for him to consider the copies available to him as ancient. If it's almost in our own time, and we're wondering what that means, was it the book or the man, John? And then other places he says the book is ancient. When it's John that he's talking about, the book's older. Several, was written before, and John's lived to an old age. And so Irenaeus leans himself in favor of an early date with ancient copies almost to his own time in 180, 100 years and some later. Several of the church fathers, continuing this quote, of the 3rd and 4th century speak of John's writing Revelation in connection with his banishment to the Isle of Patmos, which they fix as the reign of Domitian. Yet, some of them are unclear between Nero and Domitian. Clement of Alexandria says John was banished by, quote, the tyrant, a name appropriate to either, that is, either Nero or Domitian. Yet in usage, the quote continues, applies less to Domitian and more to Nero. Now, these are important names, well-known names, towering names, if you know anything about Roman history. Tacitus, Suetonius, Pliny the Elder, the Roman satirist Juvenal, all of whom predate Eusebius, and therefore his secondhand quote from Irenaeus, call Nero the proverbial tyrant. That makes him a preeminent tyrant, a notable tyrant, a big-time tyrant. So even in the face of Domitian and all the bad he might have been, Nero's proverbially tyrant. These are things for us to think about. Now, just for a minute, again, hi, I'm still here. Okay, I love you all, but tonight you're going to have to do without me. I really do think that it's better here for the slide's sake, that you look at these. And Revelation 13, look at this. It's just so important. Well, here it is again. Revelation 13:18 says, here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for the number is that of a man, and his number 666. So let's now think of that verse, not from Eusebius, not from Irenaeus, not from external commentators writing decades and even a century or more after the fact. What does it say in the book? What is the internal evidence indicating? Does it point at an earlier time or a later time for a beast of a man to be numbered 666? Now, look, we're going to do this really in depth, like 20 weeks from now, when we get to the verse by verse on Revelation 13:18. But just now to tease you, whose name equals the number? The common usage Neron, full name, I didn't even give it all, but Nero with the N on the end is going to add up to the 666. And they used it constantly in the first century. His name does add up to 666. We do need to remember that these people could calculate the number. And there's a textual variant. Some manuscripts of Revelation don't even have 666. Did you know that? Significant. Manuscripts of Revelation don't have 666. They have 616. And to my knowledge, since Nero often had his name spelt without the N, they did it both ways. Nero adds up to 616. Well, how about that? His name is the one name that would account for a textual variant, where some tired copyist knows it's Nero and accidentally put 616, that spelling, instead of 666, which is the other spelling for the man. What do you know? He fits. The internal evidence does fit Nero. He had better be one of our candidates. Now, you saw these verses last week. We looked into Revelation's first 3 verses. We looked at 5 different places in the last chapter, and we found that this book was soon to come to pass. That's internal evidence. I think that internal evidence will certainly be seen in the things that are said between these verses. So we'll deal with that, later and some more in detail at each verse. But right now, that's an internal evidence. It had to be somewhere in the first or immediate second early century. So let's look at some others here quickly as we bring this class in the last quarter of it up to an end. Internal evidences now. We're going to continue for a while. We'll look at a couple of externals toward the end again, but let's talk about internal evidence. What does a book say? Revelation 17:9-11. Here's the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads, which had just been described, are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. And they are 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is. The other has not yet come. And when he comes, he must remain a little while. The beast which was and is not is himself also an 8th, and is one of the 7, and he goes to destruction. Although you could translate that, he goes to destroying. So we'll talk about that in due time. 2 ways to translate it. It could mean that he gets destroyed, or the verse may be saying he's the one that goes about destroying things. We'll leave that for later. But look there in the middle. A book exists, and in its 17th chapter, it says, we're talking about 7 kings. Churches in Asia are reading about 7 kings. 5 have fallen. So they must be in the church of Asia's past as they stand there listening to this book be read to them. 1 is. Well, that must be the king that we're under right now. The other has not yet come. Well, good. Rome's going to last a while. We'll get another emperor sometime. And when he comes, he must remain a little while. The beast which was and is not is himself also an 8th, is one of the 7, goes to destruction or to destroying. Well, brother, how do we start counting? What king do we count with first? That anybody who had wisdom in Asia and anywhere else the book eventually goes would be able to calculate, just like the 666. The 7 heads are 7 mountains which the woman sets. 7 kings, 5 fallen, 1 is, the other's not yet come, and when he comes, he must remain a little while. And brethren, I'm proposing this, that we start counting the way Jews did in the first century. Josephus watched Rome fall. and then he wrote about it. Josephus was a Pharisee born about the same year that Jesus rose from the dead. Josephus is a Pharisee in the first century. How would people reading a New Testament book in the first century start counting their kings? Well, let's see what Josephus says. After him came Annius Rufus, under whom died Caesar, the second emperor of the Romans, the duration of whose reign was 57 years besides 6 months and 2 days. Josephus says the second Roman emperor, the second Caesar then, the second one reigned for 57 years, 6 months, and 2 days. And everybody in history knows no other Roman emperor got near that record. It's Augustus Octavian, who is the second emperor of the Romans, not the first, like the majority starts counting in Revelation 17. The majority starts counting based on centuries later how historians count Caesars. Well, what do you say we count the way the Jews did in the first century? Wouldn't that seem to make a little more sense? I don't care what Edward Gibbons said about it. I'm more interested in what a first century Jew would get out of it. He goes on to say, Josephus does, upon whose death Tiberius Nero, his wife Julia's son, succeeded. He's now the third emperor, as Tiberius. And continuing this quote in Antiquities, Book 18, Chapter 2, Paragraph 2, their verse referencing is a little different than ours. They don't do verses at all. It only gets to paragraphs. So it's Josephus, Book 18, Chapter 2, Paragraph 2. Continues. When Tiberius had at this time appointed Caius to be his successor, he outlived but a few days and then died after he had held the government 22 years, 5 months, and 3 days. Caius was the fourth emperor. That makes Caligula, Gaius, and Caius, 3 names for the same guy, the fourth emperor. And it makes Julius Caesar the first, not Augustus. They counted from Julius. We'll see it when we get there. But the internal evidence, counting the way they did, and the emperor they were currently under, only fits for Nero. Now let's go to Revelation 11, 1 and 2, and we're coming down to the end now. Chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. The chapter begins. There was given me a measuring rod like a staff, and someone said, get up and measure the temple of God and the altar, and those who worship in it. Leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread underfoot the holy city for 42 months. Now, if you haven't gotten my article, Mileposts in Revelation, write me at Larry@truthondisc.com. The disc is with a C.com. Larry@truthondisc.com. I'll send you that. It's got some more to say on that. How long will the nations, that is the Gentiles, tread underfoot the holy city where the temple is for 42 months? 42 months. The exact length of time of the Roman army's siege, beginning in 66 AD, to the burning and then dismantling of the temple in September of 70. It's the exact same length of time. Oh, but, it's a symbolic number, and 10 means this, and 7 means that, and if you multiply this by that and add the other, we'll get something else, and it's just any day now. No, it meant something to the people to whom it was given. Now, I want to read Luke chapter 21, verses 20 through 24. As we think about the temple and its courts being trampled underfoot for 42 months in Revelation, here's Luke 21:20. Jesus says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and those who are in the midst of the city must leave, and those who are in the country must not enter the city, because these are days of vengeance, so that all things which are written will be fulfilled. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babes in those days, for there will be great distress upon the land and wrath to this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. You think that might be 42 months? Huh? Could it be? Is it a possibility we must ignore because late date? Most guys say that, so it can't be Jerusalem. If you pick the external uninspired evidence over the internal evidence of the book and its corollaries in the Gospels and everywhere else, well then sure. It could have been 100 years after Revelation was written. It could have been the fall of Rome in 476 AD. It could be who knows what all the way down to today. Brother, I'm recommending, and we're going to study in a whole lot more detail in lessons soon to come and later to come as well. At the times of the Gentiles trampling underfoot the holy city was 42 months. That's only been done one time, a long time ago. Okay, let's go back now, full screen, in this manner. Revelation 11:8. Their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which mystically is called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. What do you guess that city is? Now, we'll fortify this as if it needed any fortification when we get to Revelation 11. Give me 6 months. We'll get there sooner or later. But come on. Come on. Now, brethren, I'm giving away a lot. I don't always do it this way. I'm wanting you to get these clues, under your belt, the internal evidence, even before we read the book. Just know from this class, picking a late date, ignoring the fall of Jerusalem, and marching off over time's endless hills to figure out what Revelation is talking about just might be the biggest mistake you'll make for 6% of the entire New Testament. Let's not do that. Let's read the book first. Let's figure out what it's talking about. Maybe it'll help us and tell us when the book was written. Now, I'm telling you now, the internal evidence favors the early date. So at least let's leave Jerusalem on the table while we read this book. And then I'll close with this, I think, most amazing external evidence. While we're talking about external evidence, there is a Syriac manuscript of the book of Revelation, which has an uninspired title that was attached to it in the 600s AD. Now, it was a long time ago, and it was a long time after the book was written, whether you take an early or a late date. The Syriac in the 600s AD has an external evidence, an uninspired title that the copyist wrote just in front of the book of Revelation as we know it. Did you know that Syriac manuscript is the oldest text of Revelation known to man? We have no text of the book of Revelation that predates that one. All the others have gone to dust. But in the 600s AD, the oldest one to have survived the ravages of time, the copyist who wrote it put just above the book of Revelation this quote: "The revelation which was made by God to John, the evangelist, in the island of Patmos, into which he was thrown by Nero Caesar, not Domitian. Domitian's mighty popular, but he wasn't even mentioned 1400 years ago. The oldest manuscript evidence, if you want to talk external evidence, the oldest manuscript evidence says Nero put John on Patmos, where he wrote the book of Revelation, not Domitian, who would lead us, I think, brethren, on the merriest turns about the mulberry bush, chasing a wild, wild goose. Bye. See you next week, I hope.